welcome everybody. Before we proceed, I would like to thank three people who were very instrumental in arranging this event. Katie Earle, Lindsay Weiss, and Wesley Fox. Thank you very much, guys, for all your help. But mostly, thanks to our guest, Vladimir Kara-Murza. Well, let me start with congratulations, Volodya, on being the very first recipient of the Sergei Magnitsky Human Rights Prize, I believe in London a couple of weeks ago. What was it like?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be here at the American Enterprise Institute and to do events with Leon. It's becoming a tradition now. So it was indeed on the 16th of November, the day that Sergei Magnitsky was killed in Matrosskaya Tishina prison back in 2009, and they had the annual Magnitsky Human Rights Awards in London. This is a biannual ceremony, and I was indeed honored and very humbled to receive one this year. I certainly don't think that I'm worthy of any kind of award, but I know I will cherish this for the rest of my life. It's a great honor, but more than that, I'm very proud to have played a small part in this process of convincing members of the US Congress 5 years ago now, in fact exactly 5 years ago, in December 2012 this happened, to pass a law which was named in memory and in honor of Sergei Magnitsky, and which introduced what should really be a simple and straightforward principle, but was in fact a groundbreaking principle in international practice. It was the principle that responsibility for human rights abuse should be assigned to where it actually belongs, not to an entire country and to all the citizens of that country, as general sanctions do, but to the actual people who perpetrate human rights abuses and corruption. So what the Magnitsky Act did is it laid down the principle that those people, those Russian officials and those oligarchs in and around the Putin regime who are responsible for human rights abuse and corruption will no longer be able to receive visas to the US and use the US financial and banking system for their personal gain. And the reason this is so important is because of the nature of the Putin regime, the way it is structured, and the fundamental hypocrisy and the double standard that is right at the heart of the Putin regime. And that is that the people who are in charge of the Russian government today, they want to steal in Russia, but spend in the West. And this is the way they have done things for years. The same people who undermine and violate and abuse the most basic norms of democratic society at home want to use the privileges and opportunities of democratic society in Western countries for themselves and for their families. You know, they want to educate their children in Western schools. They want to keep their money in Western banks. When I say their money, that's the money they've actually stolen from the Russian people. They want to buy high-class real estate in yachts and luxury cars and wherever else in Western countries. And we think that this hypocrisy and this double standard has to stop. And this was the premise behind the Magnitsky Act, and I'm proud to have played my small part in helping pass this measure into law. And when the Magnitsky Act was passed, exactly 5 years ago, at the end of 2012, Boris Nemtsov and I were sitting on that day in the visitors' gallery of the US House of Representatives chamber, watching as they were voting on this bill, and as this bill was becoming law in front of our eyes. And I remember Boris said on that day that this is the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign country, because it holds to account those who violate the rights of Russian citizens and those who steal the money of Russian taxpayers. And I'm happy to say that since then, since the Magnitsky Act was passed here in the US 5 years ago, 3 more countries have followed this example: Canada, Estonia, and Lithuania. Lithuania just last week, the president of Lithuania, Dalia Grybauskaitė, signed this bill into law. And I'll be in Vilnius next week to meet with members of the Lithuanian parliament and to thank them for doing this. And we hope that other countries, other Western democracies, also take a lead on this issue and send a message to those crooks and those human rights abusers in the Putin regime that they will no longer be welcome in Western democratic countries. And there's one other thing that Boris Nemtsov said back 5 years ago when the Magnitsky law was being passed here. He said that when Russia becomes a democratic country with the rule of law, he wanted to be the first one to go back to the US and other Western countries and advocate for a repeal of the Magnitsky Act. because it will no longer be needed, because we will have a real justice system and a real rule of law system that will be able to take care of the crooks and the abusers and the corrupt officials. Now, of course, we know that he will not be doing that. And, the last 2 years have taught me to be very careful about making predictions, but I certainly hope to be able to one day go back here and to Ottawa and to Vilnius and Tallinn and hopefully London and other capitals of democratic countries to say that this law is no longer needed because we have a system of government, a real system of government and justice and the rule of law that is able to protect those principles.
Well, thank you very much, Volodya. It's always, there are multiple pleasures in chatting with you in public, but one of them is that you're such an unusual combination of an Oxford-educated
Cambridge,
sorry.
Never confuse the two.
All right. I thought I'll test it.
It's like if you said that I'm from St. Petersburg.
Yeah. All right. A Cambridge-educated historian and an opposition activist. So let me. I think it's the same hat. They're just maybe different halves or different colors. But all right. Let's stress the analyst part of your hat. Looks like Russia is emerging from a recession. There are various reasons why. Primarily, it's not because of investment. It's primarily because people borrow and spend. But whatever the reason, the consensus is about 1.7% GDP growth. At the same time, paradoxically, this is the fourth year in a row where the real incomes are falling. And Alexei Kudrin, to whom we will return, probably known to everybody, I don't need to introduce him here, said that poverty is a real problem in Russia. And the so-called social protests are up this year, 56% over the last year. And people protest, the rising utility costs, healthcare, transportation, housing, layoffs, and I thought we would never hear it from, since the post-revolutionary, impoverished 1990s when the oil was $18 a barrel, wage arrears. I said so-called social protests because both the regime and the opposition seem to distinguish rather sharply between what's going on in those protests and what they call political protests. Where they could be called political, they're strictly localized, or at least that seems to be. People protest against a particular mayor, a particular governor, a particular police force, particular municipality. But we have not seen the repeat of the March 26 national anti-corruption demonstration in, I believe, 84 Russian cities. Now, I wonder, though, in an economy where 70% of the GDP is either owned or controlled by the government or subsidized by the government in the public sector, there is always a tinge of politics in every social protest. Is that right?
Well, absolutely. There's always a fine line between social and political protest, and it's not always clear where you draw it. For example, a couple of years ago, we had those protests by long-haul truck drivers around the country against this new road tariff system that was introduced. And on the one hand, you can say that, well, it's a social protest because they're just protesting against those new tariffs that they have to pay. But of course, we know that entire system was introduced for the personal gain of the Rotenberg brothers, who are, one of the closest oligarchs politically and financially to Putin and his regime. So, it's debatable whether that was social or political. But I think what's interesting about it, we've always had this notion for years in Russia, maybe for decades, and you've written a lot about it too, that, at some point, it's those economic and social protests that could become the drivers of political change. But I think actually, if you look at the last 18 years now already of the Putin regime, the biggest the biggest protest, the biggest street protest that happened under the Putin regime happened actually when the economy was doing very well in December 2011, January 2012. It had in fact nothing to do with social or economic grievances. In fact, the people who came out on Bolotnaya and Sakharov Avenue back in December 2011, 6 years ago now, They didn't come for money or for wages or for any social and economic demands. They came for their dignity. They came because they felt insulted at such a blatant stealing of their votes. You know, "We are not cattle" was one of the most popular slogans on Bolotnaya on December the 10th, 2011. And in fact, a lot of the people who came out to protest were representatives of the relatively affluent urban middle classes. And again, it was not about the social or the economic issues, it was about dignity. It was about people wanting to be citizens in their own country, as opposed to voiceless subjects who could be told, you know, that I'll be president, he'll be prime minister for the next 12 years, goodbye. You know, that was the driving issue. And of course, those protests that you just referred to that we saw all across the country in the last few months, in March, and then again in June, and then again in the last few weeks with the so-called presidential election campaign beginning and going underway. Of course, the March protest, as you pointed out exactly, took place in more than 80 towns and cities across Russia. In June, it was already almost 200. It was a much bigger wave. On June the 12th, Russian National Day, symbolically the day when the Russian parliament back in 1990 adopted the declaration of sovereignty from the Soviet central government. And I think the most striking feature of those protests, I mean, ostensibly they were about corruption and against corruption, the pervasive government corruption. The immediate trigger was that investigation done by Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation into the secret financial empire of current Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, you know, his yachts, his villas, his vineyards in Tuscany and all the other stuff. But it was, of course, about much more than that. It was not just against the corruption itself, it was also against the reasons, the underlying reasons that allow for this corruption, the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, the lack of the rule of law. And at the end of the day, the fact that one person has now been in power in our country for 18 years. Let's just pause and think about it. Putin is now, if you count by the number of days, Putin has now been in power longer than Leonid Brezhnev, the symbol of Soviet totalitarian stagnation. You know, the generation of our parents grew up knowing nobody but Brezhnev. We now have an entire...
The generation of our parents.
Well, it's back for Oxford, Leon.
Okay.
We now have an entire generation in Russia who grew up not knowing anything except the Putin regime. When I go around the country to different regions as part of my work with the Open Russia movement and speak to these young activists in different places, you know, someone who's 18, 20, 22, I have to remind myself that I'm speaking to someone who does not know anything except Putin. You know, I'm old enough to remember what real elections are like in Russia. I'm old enough to remember the government and the president harshly criticized on national TV. The people who are now coming out to protest all across the country, for them it's something out of fantasy books. They don't know this. But they're instinctively understand increasingly that it's not okay in a European country in the 21st century to have one man staying in power for 18 years without regard for such niceties as free elections and term limits. And they increasingly understand that the fact that the government is unchangeable, and that it's not possible to change it, that elections are not real, that there are no checks and balances, there are no real institutions, that all that is the cause of the pervasive corruption or of the abuses of basic principles of rule of law and human rights. And there is this growing awareness of the link between the social economic problems that exist and the political situation that have caused them. And I think also, and this is what I just saw from again, going all across Russia in the last 3 years and speaking to these people, to these activists in different regions, we are seeing increasingly with many of these young people, their sense of dignity and their self-awareness as citizens of their country gradually becoming stronger than the sense of fear, of political repression. I think that is a very important turning point. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be a momentous event, but it's a gradual process, but it's already happening. And I think we saw this very clearly with the protest waves in March and in June. Many of the people who came out to protest in March, of course, this was the first time ever that they came out to take part in a political protest. And many of them, as you know, more than 1,000 people on a single day were arrested. Many of them were jailed, given 5, 10, 15 days of administrative jail terms for, quote-unquote, mass disturbances. This is Kremlin speak for taking part in peaceful demonstrations. And when they were coming out from those jails after those administrative terms, they would be approached by journalists or by just friends and supporters and asked, well, presumably now you're not going to go to protest again after this. They said, no, we're definitely coming out again after this. And in June there were more people and more places, more cities and towns participated in the protests than in March. So I think this is a very hopeful trend for Russia, but a very worrying one for the Putin regime.
Volodya, to watch Russian TV, certainly to listen to the Duma deputies and to see some of the most popular talk shows, you would think that Russia is at state of war and Vladimir Putin is a wartime president. Just the other week, he held a marathon, 4-day, non-stop session with the top Russian military commanders, and as part of finalizing yet another state armament program. This one is over $300 billion, continuation from the first program inaugurated 2008, in much higher rubles. At that time it was 700 billion, but by now it's probably the same. Bottom line is Russia is committed. This one is to run to 2027. In the past less than 20 years, spend over 2/3 of $1 trillion on armament. At the signing of the program, according to the Russian media, Putin directed all major enterprises, irrespective of ownership, to be prepared to expand defense-related production, as he put it, in the time of need. I can't recall anything like this from before perestroika. What is going on here?
Yeah, he also said that every type of production in Russia must be prepared to switch to военные рельсы, military rail.
Military
and of course, all these jokes on social media about what's the right caliber of the pasta that will need to be produced. But you're right, we have, we've not heard it for a long time, but we have heard that before. If you look at Russian state TV and those so-called talk shows, the hour of hate, again, to use the old Soviet term. If you watch
an Orwellian term, actually.
Yes, but we use that a lot, of course. So if you watch those, which I advise you, by the way, not to do if you value your nervous system, but I sometimes have to just to know what they're thinking, what they're doing. You would hear this constant, warmongering is probably the best way to describe it, and the propaganda and just the intensification of hate and of turning the U.S. into radioactive ash and talk about the West now as enemies, and of course this constant search for traitors and national traitors and fifth columnists and foreign agents inside of Russia. And this has been going on for years now at an increasing pace because, frankly, that's the only thing this regime has to stand on. They have to kind of ratchet up this rhetoric because they have not much to point to in terms of their economic success. Because there is none, or there are very few. They like to pretend this, of course, as you know, this catchphrase that Putin's propaganda often uses to describe, what his regime has supposedly done is that they raised Russia from its knees. That's the phrase that's been used for years. But, if you actually look at what they have done in terms of, okay, let's accept their terms and let's look at what they've done in terms of foreign policy and geopolitics. Under President Boris Yeltsin, who is now a demonized figure in Putin's state TV, Russia became a member of the G8, for example, the most respected club of world powers. Under Mr. Putin, we were expelled from the G8. What's more, where is that rising from the knees? Because of the Putin regime's behavior, we now have very harsh, very biting general economic sanctions introduced against our country by the leading economic powers of the world. For me, that's not really something in line with Russian national interests. So they have nothing to stand on in terms of real achievements. So they have to build up this wall of pretense and propaganda that everybody, we are a besieged fortress, everybody is against us. And of course, the enemies themselves change from year to year. One year it's Estonia, the other year it's Georgia. Now, of course, that place has been firmly taken by the United States for many years now, because that's the only thing they have to go on. We can discuss of what's actually real in this, and I know some people are seriously raising the prospect, or does that mean there'll be, war at some point or something like that? But I think this is mostly just a propaganda image that they need to present something in the public sphere because they have nothing real to present and to show.
All right, we'll come back to Putin as a wartime president. A footnote is that one of the products, probably a more conspicuous product of that state armament program, is what in the NATO designation, a Borei A class nuclear submarine. outfitted with 20 intercontinental ballistic missile tubes, launching tubes, each capable of carrying 6 independently targeted nuclear warheads, and the name of that submarine is Prince Vladimir.
We have one standing by the Kremlin now, as you know as well, on the Borovitsky Gate.
No, I didn't know that.
Oh, there was a new monument put up last year, just on the side of the Borovitsky Gate, to Prince Vladimir.
Yeah. Well, a fascinating issue is also, I believe, the 8th monument to Alexander III, which is
put up 2 weeks ago.
probably, in modern times, the most reactionary Russian leader. If we have time, we'll touch on this. Volodya, a little bit about the state of opposition. Ksenia Sobchak presumably wanted to run from Parnas, the party of Boris Nemtsov, I believe your party at some point as well. But Parnas demurred, specifically Mikhail Kasyanov, citing the lack of agreement with Yavlinsky and Navalny. And so Sobchak is now running from a fairly obscure party, Civic Initiative, assuming, of course, she collects 100,000 signatures. Her program strikes me as quite liberal, especially, concerning Crimea, Ukraine, relationship with the West. What is going on here? Could you tell us? It's a little bit complex for me.
Well, I think what's going on is the same that has been happening in the last few election cycles, national election cycles in Russia. So as you recall, beginning from at least 2008, genuine opponents of Mr. Putin have been blocked from participating in elections, have been blocked from the ballot. In 2008, this was Mikhail Kasyanov, the former prime minister, and Vladimir Bukovsky, the famous Soviet-era dissident. In 2012, at the height of the protest, it was Grigory Yavlinsky who was blocked from the ballot, and according to serious analysis from the time, he could have got quite a lot of votes because that was the height of the protest movement. And he's not really a polarizing figure. I mean, a lot of people could have supported him just because that's the way of protesting against the regime. They removed him, and instead of him, back in 2012, as you remember well, the Kremlin put up the billionaire Mikhail Prokhorov to imitate an opposition presence on the ballot. And in fact, Prokhorov actually missed the deadline for submitting his nomination papers to the Central Electoral Commission. So the Central Electoral Commission waited until 3 o'clock in the morning for Prokhorov's representatives to come in. I think that's an unprecedented event in Russian electoral practice, and it's clear why. So when you say that, when you say diplomatically that provided Ksenia Sobchak collects the required signatures, I don't think that's any kind of a problem. There were 2 genuine opposition leaders who were planning to challenge Vladimir Putin in the 2018 presidential election. One was Boris Nemtsov, and he will not be challenging Putin because in February of 2012, he was killed on a bridge in front of the Kremlin. And the second is Alexei Navalny, who, unless something astonishing happens, which I don't think it will not be on the ballot in March because he was deliberately disenfranchised by the Russian authorities through a politically motivated, cooked-up court conviction, which was, by the way, overturned earlier this year by the European Court of Human Rights, but was then repeated word for word, comma for comma, in a repeat conviction, which was exactly the same as the one overturned by the ECHR earlier this year. So in the absence of genuine opponents of the ballot, I think the Kremlin still cares about the international legitimacy, or at least the veneer of international legitimacy of this so-called electoral process. And we can talk about more on this later because I think that's a very important point, the international aspect of this. So I think what they're doing with Ksenia Sobchak is trying to create that veneer of international legitimacy that, look, we have an opponent of the ballot. Of course, she's someone who's been, well, I think we can say a family friend of Vladimir Putin for years. She's the daughter of his former boss, former St. Petersburg Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, who brought Putin into politics, who brought him basically where he is today. And she said himself several times that she's very grateful to Mr. Putin personally for what she considers saving her father's life back in 1997 when there was a prosecution being prepared against him and Putin took him out outside of Russia to Paris in the late 90s, if you recall. So I think, let's not talk about Ksenia Sobchak as a serious opposition contender. I think this is all a part of the Kremlin's effort to build up a facade of a legitimate electoral process, whereas in fact, as everybody knows well, we have not had a real competitive democratic election in Russia for years. And this is not me who's saying this. If you look at every single report by observers from the OSCE and the Council of Europe in every national election in Russia after the year 2000, they have concluded that every one of them failed to meet basic democratic standards and was not free, not fair, and not competitive. I do not think we can expect any surprises in this regard on March the 18th. And since we are on this point, I do want to talk about the international aspect of this. Since we are meeting in Washington, the capital of our fellow member state in the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, one of the main mandates of which is actually election observation. So every time after the year 2000, observers from the OSCE and also from the Council of Europe assessed that elections in Russia do not meet the basic standards of democracy, that they're not free, not fair, and not democratic. Yet every single time, the leaders of those same countries, of the OSCE and the Council of Europe, the leaders of Western democracies, recognized the results of those so-called elections and called Putin to congratulate. Now, I'm puzzled as to how those two things make sense at the same time. I'll never forget March the 5th of 2012. This was the day after Putin's so-called election victory in 2012. We had a big opposition rally on Pushkinskaya Square, right in downtown Moscow, a couple of miles down from the Kremlin. And I remember there were tens of thousands of people, and we were standing on the stage. All the main opposition leaders in Russia were on that stage. Boris Nemtsov was there, Grigory Yavlinsky was there, Alexei Navalny was there, Garry Kasparov was there. And there were tens of thousands of people, just a sea of faces and flags, people, Russian citizens who came to express their anger at their votes being stolen in such a blatant fashion. And as we were standing there, so there's an 8-hour difference, as you know, between Moscow and Washington. So it was about 7 p.m. in Moscow, so it must have been about 11 a.m. here. And as we were standing there, we got news that the US administration issued a statement of congratulations, not only to Putin, which would have been half the problem, but to the people of Russia for having held this presidential elections. And I have to tell you, this felt like an insult. And it wasn't just the US. That same day, on the 5th of March, David Cameron, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, became the first Western leader to call Putin and congratulate him on the election victory. And he did so on the same day and alongside Hugo Chavez and Bashar al-Assad. So we really hope, and I know I speak on behalf of many colleagues when I say this, we really hope, first of all, that there'll be vigorous international observation of the so-called presidential election in Russia on the 18th of March. We hope that observers from our fellow OSCE member states, including the US, make their conclusions and hold the Kremlin authorities to account with regard to the international obligations that the Russian Federation has undertaken in election standards under such documents as the OSCE Charter of Paris, the OSCE Copenhagen document, and Protocol number 1 to the European Convention of Human Rights. And if these conclusions and these reports are similar to the ones we have seen every time for the last 17 years, I really hope that the leaders of Western democracies do not legitimize the results of this so-called election and do not congratulate Mr. Putin on yet another successful theft, because in effect that is what they're congratulating him on. And I think, frankly, this is the least we can expect of the leaders of countries that pride themselves on having democratic governance and the rule of law.
Volodya, maybe I should combine. There was a part of my question essentially hinting at the perennial inability of the Russian opposition to unite. When I said that, Parnas cited the inability to create a united front with Navalny and Yavlinsky, why don't we combine that also with the so-called systemic opposition? I promised to return to Alexei Kudrin. I'm returning to him. Mm-hmm. He chaired the Congress just the other week of the Civic Forum, which is his presumably loyal but nevertheless opposition. And there was even a debate between him and the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin. So what is going on there?
Well, I remember, as you pointed out right at the beginning, I'm also a historian. It's one of the hats, and I remember reading so much about the debates that were going on in the West among Western criminologists about the so-called doves and hawks in the Politburo. That there were supposedly different camps, and these were really good ones, and wink, wink, they're really they're really fighting for something good in within the system. And then in 1991-92, when Yeltsin opened the archives, especially during the process, the judicial process against the Communist Party of the Soviet Union at the Constitutional Court in 1992, when many of the former Central Committee archives were open, all these documents came out, and we saw that in fact all of those so-called doves and so-called hawks in the Politburo voted exactly the same way on all the major issues. War in Afghanistan, and the exile of Sakharov to Gorky, everything. They were all in complete agreement. So it was all just a big hoax. So I wouldn't, to be honest, pay as much attention to those different, color variations within the system, within the regime, because although, some of them are supposedly more reactionary, some are supposedly more liberal, some of them are certainly much more, pleasant on the personal level. I mean, Alexei Kudrin is a very nice man. I see him from time to time in Moscow. It's always pleasant and interesting to have conversations with him. If you compare him, with somebody like Rogozin, who's supposedly on the other spectrum of this regime, there's no comparison. But that's a personal level. That's,
First Deputy Prime Minister.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. The guy who said once that he'd gladly exchange his current position for sitting in the trenches in the Donetsk People's Republic. And of course, people have then remarked that he probably wouldn't fit in any trenches in there if you saw what he looks like. But again, I think we can discuss the differences on a personal level. But I think fundamentally, all of these people, they're all part of this regime, and they all work for its preservation in its, maybe in a little bit changed form, but still for its preservation. And you mentioned that term, of course, systemic and non-systemic opposition. I think that is a key term. I would just call it, non-systemic opposition is the real opposition. Right. The so-called systemic opposition is not. I always compare it to how the East German parliament, well, by the way, of course, Mr. Putin spent many years in East Germany. I remember when he was coming to power 18 years ago, people who wanted to see something good and everything, they said, oh, well, he spent time in Germany. He must have been influenced by it. Well, he was, although it was the wrong Germany, of course, that's the point. And the East German parliament, as you remember, also had a multi-party system on the face of it. It was not a one-party state like the Soviet Union. They actually had the Christian Democrat Union, they had the Liberal Democrat Party, they had a Peasants' Party, I think something else. But of course, that was all a big hoax also. They all voted together with Mr. Honecker all the time. And so it is for the current so-called multi-party official system in the Duma and what exists in our country. All of these so-called Duma opposition leaders are completely unanimous when it comes to all the major points for the regime. In fact, we have, and I was speaking at a conference recently, there was representatives of the opposition from Papua New Guinea, and he came out to speak, and he said, well, the situation in our country is so bad, we only have one real opposition member in parliament. And when the break began, I came up to him and I said, well, you're really lucky because that's one more than we have. We have zero. There's not a single genuine opposition member of the current Russian Duma.
Gudkov expelled or
yes,
leaving? Yeah.
Well, basically expelled, yeah. Until last year there was one, Dmitry Gudkov. And of course, again, Boris Nemtsov was planning to run for the Russian parliament last year in 2016. In fact, as you know, he was... From
Yaroslavl.
Absolutely. In fact, he was, again, to go back to your term, non-systemic opposition. Of course, the way we use those terms, the non-systemic opposition is supposed to signify genuine, real opposition, as opposed to the systemic one, which is the people who pretend to be opposition who sit on legislative bodies, and those two things are incompatible. Either you're real opposition or you sit in a legislative body. Boris Nemtsov became the first, and so far the only, leader of the non-systemic opposition to actually win an election, as he did in Yaroslavl 4 years ago in 2013. Despite all the odds, despite all the obstacles, he won election to the regional legislature there, and he was planning to run for the Russian parliament in 2016 from Yaroslavl, from the single-member district. And I remember when, at late 2014, beginning 2015, his campaign was already kind of beginning to be underway. He had a campaign staff formed, newspaper registered, and they were taking the first initial surveys, polling in the district. And I remember that they only have time to do one, but that first initial poll showed his starting position at 25%, which people who know much more about election campaign technologies than I do told me it's an amazingly high number for the start, from before anything was even done in terms of real campaigning. So there was a good chance that he was going to win a seat in the current Russian parliament. And then, of course, he was preparing to challenge Putin in 2018.
Well, Volodya, it's such a rare treat to have you, to snatch you between your various trips. I'm sure a lot of people would want to ask you questions, so let me ask you one last one. So returning to Putin as the wartime president, wartime presidents generally are not supposed to be changed unless the war ends, preferably in victory. And there has been kind of a swirl of rumors in the Russian media about proposed changes in the constitution. Among other things, nullifying the ban on more than 2 consecutive terms, or creating a parliamentary republic so Putin could become the prime minister, executive prime minister from whatever party he would like. So, what do you think of all of this? And beyond that, and probably anticipating the question, what will happen in 2024? Putin is going to be only 72. I mean, look at Mugabe. He's finally out of power, but that's a very young age. So, what do you think? I've recently read a paper where the assumption was, well, Putin will spend his term thinking of a successor because he can't run anymore. Will he be thinking of a successor? I'm not sure.
I think there are 2 very important questions in there. I'll start with the one the one connected to the regime, your last point. I think it was Harold Wilson, British Prime Minister, once said that a week is a long time in politics. So I think it's, to talk about what's going to happen in Russia in 7 years, that's in the realm of fantasy. What I would say is that first of all, I do think Putin wants to stay in power forever. Mm-hmm. I do think that. I think he made that decision pretty early on, around 2003, which was in many ways a turning point in his regime. That was the year, just in 1 year, 3 major things happened. He shut down the last independent nationwide television channel, TVS. He jailed Khodorkovsky, which was an unmistakable message to the Russia's business community that it was best to stay out of politics, and basically it was an attack on any kind of independent activity by the big business. And it was, of course, the year of the first rigged national election in December 2003, the election which saw genuine democratic opposition ejected from the State Duma, both SPS and Yabloko, both pro-democracy liberal parties. So I think it was back then that he made the decision that he wants to stay in power forever, and everything that he's done since has, I think, corroborated that. But on the other hand, if it was only up to the dictators and their wishes to stay in power forever, then every dictator would stay in power forever everywhere in the history of the world. And of course, as we know, that's not what happens. And Russian history has a funny way of having major, shifting, massive political change start like this. And this is a good year to discuss it. It's the Jubilee year, 2017. I'm old enough to remember August 1991. And, this was in many ways a formative experience for me and for people in my generation. And, if someone said at the beginning of August of 1991 that by the end of August 1991 there would not be a Soviet regime, I think not many people would have believed it, but that is what happened. And much more recently, again, if in September 2011, at the time of the castling, that's the term, right? The Rokirovka, when Putin and Medvedev announced a job swap, if somebody said to me or to many of my colleagues back then that 3 months from now, there'll be 100,000 people standing across the road from the Kremlin demanding Putin's resignation, we would have thought that person is living in cloud cuckoo land, but that is what happened. So Russian history has this funny way of showing dictators and dictatorial regimes and authoritarian regimes that it's not always up to them what's going to happen. And this is where I want to come to the first part of your question. You mentioned constitutional changes. I think you mentioned it in terms of what the regime might want to do, changing the system, for them to stay in power forever. But I want to turn this around a little bit and talk about the actual importance of having a constitutional change in Russia. This is what we want to do. I mean, one of the major policy positions and positions of principle for our movement, for the Open Russia movement, is to change Russia from a presidential to a parliamentary republic, the genuine parliamentary republic, not a fake one, the one you referred to, a way for Putin to stay in power forever, but actually a real parliamentary republic. Because, when people ask us, so, okay, you don't want Putin to be in power, but who do you want to replace him with? And we say, we don't replace him with a who, we want to replace him with a what. It's not a question of changing the person at the top. It's a question of changing the system. It hasn't worked out well in Russian history. I think we can say this certainly by now. When one person had all the tools and all the instruments of power in his or her hands, mostly his. So I think the question is, as Andrei Piankovsky, who is in the audience here today, once wrote, we don't want to change a bad czar for a good czar. We won't have no czar at all in Russia. And that is a very important point. There is no such thing as a good czar. And so what we want to see in Russia after Vladimir Putin is a much more balanced system, much more if not a pure parliamentary system, then at least a much more balanced mixed presidential parliamentary system, something they have in France, for example. We think we should get away from that paradigm when everything depends on one person. So the goal of our movement, as well as I know many other political parties and movements in the Russian opposition, is to move to a different system after Vladimir Putin, in one way or another, voluntarily or not very voluntarily, leaves power. Because again, since Russian history shows us that political change, big political change, happens quickly and usually begins unexpectedly, we need to be preparing for it ahead of time. Because one of the things that happened both in 1991 and in a way in 2011 is that many of the Democrats were not ready for what was going to come. We can discuss the many mistakes that were committed by the Democratic government in the early 90s, and we can discuss the many mistakes committed by the opposition leadership at the height of the protests in 2011, 2012. I think many of those mistakes were fundamentally caused by the fact that things happen so quickly and unexpectedly. We never know when next big political change happens in Russia. It may be well before 2024. So I think our task as a responsible opposition movement is to be preparing for that change now. And this is what we are trying to do, because when things start happening, it's too late to sit down and try to figure out what to do now.
Well, excellent. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so please ask them, in an abbreviated form. Please.
Hi, David Colvin. Could I just follow up on your last?
There's a microphone there.
By the way, congratulations to the beautiful new facilities here for AEI, Doctor. To your point about replacing who and what, after the coordinating committee period and Bolotnaya, it seemed that the Kremlin had identified Udaltsov as probably the most dangerous figure of the opposition. After all, he was the one they actually jailed. And it seemed that the other ones, they slow-rolled. Now, putting his personal qualities aside, one could say demographically, maybe that's because of who his base was. If you think that the goal is to replace what instead of who, what Navalny and Volkov and the others are doing now, and the nation dignity that you identified among the youth, what is it that you think the opposition that you'd like to see is poised outside of Moscow and Peter to take advantage of this change, as opposed to an Udaltsov or an Udaltsov-like figure speaking to that base, again, outside of Moscow and Peter?
Okay, thank you for the question. Well, first of all, let's say that the most dangerous opposition figure for the Kremlin was Boris Nemtsov. They did something much worse to him than they did to Udaltsov. Udaltsov, thankfully, is out of prison now, a couple of months. He was in prison, if you count the home arrest, for more than 4 years. And just as a footnote, we have more than 100 political prisoners in Russia today still. Some of the prominent ones were released. Udaltsov was released. Daria Poludova was released. the remaining Bolotny prisoners were released. I think all of them now, literally in the last few months. But let's not forget there are more than 100 political prisoners in Russia today, 117 by the latest count by the Memorial Human Rights Center, itself, of course, now designated as a foreign agent. The human rights organization was once founded by Andrei Sakharov. And they use very conservative and even, I would say, restrictive criteria to designate somebody as a political prisoner. And even by that criteria, it's a criteria based on Resolution 1900 of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And even according to those criteria, we have 117 political prisoners in Russia. Just to put it in context, in 1975, when Sakharov wrote his Nobel Prize lecture, he listed 126 prisoners of conscience. And that was, of course, USSR, which was twice as big as Russia. So we're back to the same kind of figures. I think the most important point, I think, that you refer to is the need to go outside Moscow and St. Petersburg. Those have been, well, I think for centuries we could say, the traditional hotbeds of political activity. Everything in Russia always happened in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And with the big protests that we saw in these last few months, we saw this paradigm at least beginning to be broken, especially with the June wave, when almost 200 towns and cities, literally from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, took part in these protests. And some of these places have not seen any political protest, well, at least since 91, maybe since 1917, some of them. And now, as we see Navalny, for example, go around the country in his unofficial presidential campaign, which he's conducting, he's gathering, thousands of people on the squares in places where nobody thought any political activity could exist. Kemerovo, Izhevsk, people, not the places you automatically think of when you think about opposition activity in Russia. So I agree completely with your point. I think it's very important to go beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg and to go outside, to go to the country, to different parts of the country. We try to do this as Open Russia as well. We now have 28 regional branches as of this week. The last one was opened 3 days ago in Aron. And we feel it's important also to break this paradigm of everything happening just in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And in the last 3 years since we've relaunched Open Russia, I've seen more of Russia than in my whole previous life. Because we try to spread our work and do a lot of work in the regions. Udaltsov, of course, is somebody who represents a very much left-wing political tradition. And of course, since he was jailed, he's also, just like Navalny, he's not allowed to contest any elections now. They made up this law a few years ago, which, by the way, there's nothing in the Russian constitution about any such limitations on taking part in elections. The only limitations the Russian constitution mentions is that if you're actually in prison, according to a court sentence, then you cannot take part in elections. Or if you are insane, or if you are below the age of 35, if we're talking about presidential elections. No other limitations. But Putin and his mad printer, the State Duma, have rubber-stamped all these additional restrictions in the last few years. Now, if you have dual citizenship, you cannot run in elections. Even if you have residency permit abroad, you cannot run in elections. If you have even a suspended court sentence, which is what Navalny have, you cannot run. Even if you are released from prison, like Udaltsov, like Khodorkovsky, for example, you cannot run in any kind of election. So they put up all these additional barriers. We think, of course, needless to say, that every Russian citizen who is eligible according to the constitution, including Udaltsov, should have the right to run in elections. And we also think that it's important that the opposition, and this is go back to the what and not the who, that the Russian opposition has many strong political figures within it of different political persuasions. People like Udaltsov on the left, people like Navalny, people like Dmitry Gudkov, who was already mentioned, the former member of the State Duma, people like Lev Schlossberg, a very prominent figure in the Russian opposition, one of the leaders of the Yabloko party. He was the person who, 3 years ago now, provided the first documented definitive proof of the presence of regular Russian troops in Ukraine, which was, of course, something the Kremlin lied about and denied. And when he did this was in Pskov. He's a member of the regional parliament in Pskov. And it was a Pskov paratrooper division that was sent into Ukraine. Members of it were killed there, and then they were brought back in body bags and buried like dogs in unmarked graves with numbers instead of names, because the Russian Defense Ministry did not want to admit that they were there. And Schlossberg found them, he took pictures of them, he published it in his newspaper. He was beaten up, he was in a coma in hospital, he was stripped of his parliamentary seat. And then last year, he was elected back to the regional parliament by the people of Pskov. He's a member of parliament now again. People like him, people like Yevgeny Roizman, who is the current mayor of Ekaterinburg, the fourth largest city in Russia, one of the most prominent figures in the opposition today. He wanted to run for regional governor from Yabloko earlier this year. He was again blocked from the ballot, not allowed to run. So we think there should be many strong political figures in the Russian opposition. And although I disagree with probably most of what Sergei Udaltsov stands for politically, I certainly think that he should have an absolute right to run in elections. And I think when we have a freely elected parliament in Russia one day, he'll most likely be a member of it.
Anders?
Anders Åslund, Atlantic Council, thank you very much for an excellent analysis. And as always, I have a standard question. What can we do? And I'm thinking particularly of two issues. One is this sanction law now, the section 241 of pointing out people close to the Kremlin. Do you think that this can be effective? And the other question is, Putin got obviously furious over the release of the Panama Papers in April 2016 and all that it exposed about him. Do you think it would be effective if the US really reveals the riches of the Putin crowd that obviously exist in this country?
Thank you, Anderson. It's always great to see you, and thank you for the questions. When we were discussing this issue, Boris Nemtsov came up with this formula back a few years ago when people asked him, what should the West do with regard to what's happening in Russia? He would always say, don't punish the country, go after the scoundrels. Страну не трогать, негодяев наказывать. And this is, of course, what Section 241 does. And you had an excellent panel up on Capitol Hill a couple of weeks ago, along with Andre and other colleagues. And I think this is, in this whole law that was passed last summer, this is probably the most important provision. Section 241 is a provision that tasks the Department of the Treasury, the State Department, in coordination with the Director of National Intelligence, to publish a report by the deadline of February 2nd of next year, 2018, detailing the people and naming them by names, the people who have political proximity to Putin and his regime, the oligarchs, the politically powerful officials, to detail their involvement in corruption, to detail the non-Russian business associations, to the foreign business associations they have. And I know for a fact that in the last few weeks, many of these people have sent emissaries to this city to try to approach, lobbyists and people on the Hill to see if it would be possible for them not to be named in this report. And I think yet again, the Kremlin shows what is the most sensitive point for them. And the most sensitive point for them is when you go after their personal financial interests. And this is what we always say. Again, as Boris said, don't punish the country, go after the scoundrels. We do not think it is right to punish an entire country for the actions of a small, unelected clique sitting in the Kremlin. And this is why the Magnitsky Act was so brilliant in the principle that it introduced, that you should actually assign responsibility for corruption and for human rights abuse where it is due to the people who perpetrate it. And so I would say this would be the most important thing that Western countries can do. I mean, if you listen to Kremlin propaganda, they would tell you that, we members of the Russian opposition go to the West and we ask for money and for political support, or we ask you to effect regime change in Russia, whatever other nonsense they come up with. Of course, none of that is true. We're not asking for support for us. The only thing we ask our friends and counterparts in Western democracies is that you stop, in effect, supporting the Putin regime. First of all, by treating him as a respectable and worthy partner on the international stage, which amazingly, after everything that's happened, some Western leaders still are trying to do. But also, and perhaps more importantly, stop supporting the Putin regime by allowing his cronies to use Western countries as havens for their looted wealth. As havens to store the money they've stolen from the Russian people. Because again, those people want to steal in Russia but spend in the West. And by allowing them and their dirty money into the Western countries and the Western financial systems, Western democracies have in effect been enabling, I have no other word, enabling this corruption and this human rights abuse. And so it's very heartening to see that 4 countries already, the US, Canada, Estonia, and Lithuania, have passed full-blown Magnitsky Acts that introduced this principle that if you engage in corruption and human rights abuse, you will no longer be entitled to a visa and to using the financial and banking system of Western countries. We hope more countries do that. And this section 241 is, of course, very, very important. And although it does not entail sanctions per se, it's just a report, it's just publication, I think given their nervous reaction, it's a safe bet to say that those types of things are the most effective ones. And I would also mention another thing that I think is important. And I know some people dismiss this as small and symbolic, what I'm going to say now. And although it is symbolic, it's certainly not small. Russia is a country of symbols. As you know, I always remind people of this. When, after the victory over the coup leaders in August 1991, Muscovites went to the Lubyanka Square to take down the statue of Dzerzhinsky because that was a symbol. One of the first things that Putin did when he came to power was to return the Soviet-era Stalinist national anthem. Again, a symbol of what was to come. And it was a very powerful message for those who were willing to listen. So what I'm going to say now, that's a symbol, but that's a very important one. Tomorrow, on December the 6th, and this is actually the reason I'm in Washington this week, there will be a hearing at the Washington, D.C. City Council on a bill that would designate the block in front of the Russian embassy here in Washington on Wisconsin Avenue Northwest as Boris Nemtsov Plaza, in memory and in honor of the late Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. We tried to move this initiative initially through Congress, where it was blocked by Senator Bob Corker, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, as was reported last week in the Washington Post. And as Alexei Venediktov, the editor-in-chief of Echo Moskvy radio station, said publicly this week, he told this story of how in July, during the G20 summit, there was a meeting. That was the first meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, but before it, there was a meeting between Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State. And apparently, this is according to what Venediktov said 3 days ago, literally. Apparently, at that meeting in July, they went through different issues that need to be addressed and resolved for the bilateral relationship to get, quote, back on track. They talked about Crimea and sanctions and Ukraine and Syria. And apparently, according to Venediktov, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov specifically asked Tillerson not to rename that block in front of the Russian embassy after Boris Nemtsov. So again, anybody who tells you that symbolic things are not important, I think that's the best answer. So from what we understand, Mr. Corker, because of this request from the administration, blocked it. But thankfully, there is also jurisdiction of the DC City Council over DC, not just Congress. So the DC City Council has taken up this initiative, and they're moving ahead with it. Tomorrow is going to be the first and the only public hearing on the bill. I will be testifying in favor of this measure, as will Zhana Nemtsova, Boris Nemtsov's daughter, who is flying in today. She'll be testifying tomorrow. And the reason this is so important for us, what I'm going to say at that hearing tomorrow, it seems we're not allowed to honor the memory of a Russian statesman in Russia. The astonishing thing is that the Kremlin and the Putin regime are still fighting Boris Nemtsov today, even after he's dead. They have rejected every initiative, every public petition for any kind of commemoration in Moscow. Forget about a street name, not even a small sign, nothing. And you know the reason they gave for this? They said there's a lack of consensus. Now, we have streets in Moscow named after Hugo Chavez, the late Venezuelan dictator. We have a street in Moscow, in the south of Moscow, in Butovo, named after Akhmat Kadyrov, the former Chechen strongman. This is the guy who once declared a jihad against Russia, and who once called on his followers to, quote, kill as many Russians as possible, end of quote. There was no problem with consensus for naming a street in Moscow after that guy. But the former deputy prime minister of the Russian Federation, there seems to be a big problem with it. And there were signs that were put up by the residents of the apartment buildings where Boris lived in Moscow and Yaroslavl that were taken down within days. More than that, almost every night, the Moscow municipal authorities and the Moscow police come into the bridge to the unofficial memorial on the spot where he was killed, because more than 2.5 years on, people still bring flowers and light candles and put pictures, kind of unofficial makeshift memorial, and they take those flowers away and they pillage it and they destroy it. And you should see the videos. There are videos of this on YouTube and Facebook filmed by volunteers. You have grown men in police uniforms stealing flowers in the middle of the night. So they're still fighting him. They're still fighting his memory. And so what we're going to say tomorrow at that council hearing is that apparently we're not allowed to honor a Russian statesman in Russia. So we're very grateful to citizens and to elected representatives of free countries who are stepping in to do what we cannot do. And there was, of course, a precedent for this, also set in this town and also connected with Russia. In 1984, the US Congress designated a small stretch of 16th Street Northwest in front of the old Soviet embassy, it's now the Russian ambassador's residence, in honor of Andrei Sakharov, who was then in internal exile in Gorky. This was 1984. And of course, as you can imagine, the Politburo and the Soviet Foreign Ministry were furious when this happened. But I always remind people, only 7 years after that, and this goes back to the question you said, when can we expect change in Russia? Only 7 years after 1984, in 1991, the Russian ambassador proudly installed a bust of Andrei Sakharov inside the embassy itself. And he was still, by the way, standing there the last time I was declared non grata in the Russian embassy in 2012, so the last time I was being there was 5 years ago, but it was still standing there. And this is how things change in Russia. So I have absolutely no doubt that there will come a day when the Russian state is proud to have its embassy in Washington standing on Boris Nemtsov Plaza. And I know that day will all be very grateful for our friends in Western democracies, including here in the US, who made this statement and made this point. It's very symbolic, but it's certainly not small.
Well, I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions, but Volodya, it was brilliant as always. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here.